In a few months, the United States will mark its 250th anniversary. There will be speeches, parades, an ocean of red, white, and blue. We'll be told to celebrate our history, our liberty, our democracy. We'll be told to stand proud of the nation our founders gave us. But I find I don't have much to celebrate. How can you celebrate a republic when a powerful faction is actively working to turn it into a theocracy? How can you cheer for the Constitution when the very people who swore an oath to it are trying to tear it down from the inside, citing a God that isn't mentioned once? How do you set off fireworks for a nation that feels like it's holding its breath, waiting for the fall? The foundation of this country is under attack, not from a foreign enemy, but from within. And the attack is disguised as patriotism. It's disguised as faith. It's built on a lie. It's built on a false foundation. Hello and welcome to the False Foundation podcast. My name is Jim. Thank you for listening. When I enlisted in the Army, I was required to swear an oath to support and defend the U.S. Constitution. I may have been a naive, wide-eyed kid when I did it, but it meant something to me then, and it still does today. For the first time in modern history, a nation was founded not on the authority of a divine right or sacred text, but on the power of we the people. That fact is what gave the founders the license to imbue the population with freedom of conscience, the first freedom, the one that provided for all the rest. I may not have always agreed with my leadership or even held the appropriate respect for them when they gave me orders, but I always believed in the Constitution and the oath that I took. Like many others in our country, I have watched in disbelief as the Christian Nationalist movement has become mainstream. I've heard elected officials and religious leaders parrot the same ideological bullshit that undermines the concept of freedom held and implemented by the framers of our Constitution. The history of our country is being rewritten in real time, and a narrative has taken shape that is an objective lie, that our nation was founded on some ill-defined set of Christian principles, and was designed to be a Christian nation. It is difficult for me to imagine something as more dishonest and abhorrent than that nonsensical claim. Our nation was created to be secular, to be accepting of all faiths or no faith. Our nation abandoned the elitist concept of religious toleration for religious pluralism, biblical law for common law and common sense. We threw off the rule of a despotic tyrant who was also the head of a church for self-governance and the pursuit of happiness. The revisionist history of this false foundation has become a core tenet of conservative politics, not just some fringe movement. It is a lie. So who am I and why should you care? I'm not an academic, I'm no historian, and I'm not a politician. I'm an Army combat veteran, a patriot, and a really pissed off citizen. And part of what makes me so pissed off is something I call rhetorical stolen valor. I see these politicians and pastors talking about being spiritual warriors, prayer warriors, putting on the full armor of God to fight a war for the soul of America. As someone who has been in an actual war, that is an insult. The full armor of God won't save you from a hail of machine gun fire, a mortar attack. Hell, I'm not sure it'll even save you from a sharp insult. They are co-opting the language of real sacrifice and real combat to give their political crusade a sense of gravity and heroism it can never earn. They want the respect owed to a warrior without facing any of the risks. That's stolen valor, and I won't stand for it. But more than anything, I'm a husband, a father, and a grandfather, and I am committed to doing whatever I can to ensure that my kids and my grandkids have the same freedoms and opportunities that I had. I refuse to stand by and let our nation be reshaped in the name of some religious fundamentalist movement without doing something about it. For a long time, I'd been thinking about doing a project like this. I was concerned by the rise of Christian nationalism, but it was the recent launch of the White House's America Praise initiative that made the decision for me. That was the straw that broke the camel's back. The moment this threat moved from the fringe to the highest level of government. In anticipation of America's 250th anniversary, the U.S. government has decided to make the celebration all about, wait for it, prayer. They're calling the initiative America Praise, and the announcement can be found at the White House official website, where we receive, quote, an invitation to prayer and rededication of the United States as one nation under God, unquote. complete with a video history and a pamphlet titled Prayers and Proclamation Throughout American History that contains some of the most intellectually dishonest content you can imagine. In addition to the loaded language about rededication, there is a digital copy of a painting of Washington kneeling in prayer at Valley Forge. The invitation to rededicate the U.S. to one nation under God presupposes that the U.S. had once been so dedicated. It was not. Under God was not added to the American lexicon in the Pledge of Allegiance until 1954, when it was clumsily inserted into the pledge to assuage the fears stoked by the Red Scare of the atheistic Soviet Union. The original pledge did not contain the language and wasn't itself written until 1892, well over a century after the U.S. Constitution had been ratified. The painting of Washington is another story, a made-up story. There is no contemporaneous account of Washington praying at Valley Forge. Not in journals, diaries, news articles, nothing. This was invented myth, written by Parson Weems decades after Washington's death. So listen, there are a lot of things that one could point out when celebrating our nation's birthday, marking a quarter of a millennium. I'm not sure that praying is one of the things to be seriously considered. During a hot summer in 1787 at the Constitutional Convention, the arguments had reached a fever pitch, and it seemed like an impasse was imminent. A then 81-year-old Benjamin Franklin proposed that they might want to consider praying about the issues for an answer. They didn't pray. They didn't even vote on praying. They simply rejected the proposal and continued their work developing the machinery of our government without an appeal for divine assistance. It goes beyond that, though, far beyond. Aside from Franklin's failed appeal, Madison's notes show that the framers almost never used religious language or scriptures to justify their arguments. Their debates were grounded in history, philosophy, and law, making the entire process a profoundly secular one. This is further supported by the Federalist Papers, wherein many ideas are grounded in Greek and pre-Christian Roman concepts of government. No matter how pious one may believe the founders to have been, their work in nation building did not draw upon a religious mindset. Years later, in 1814, Thomas Jefferson would flatly reject the idea the American common law was based in any way on biblical precedent, denying the authority of the Ten Commandments. Now, I'm not going to make the case that religion didn't play a role in American history. That would be dishonest. What I will say is that there is a long history of religious influence on the North American continent, not all of it good, whether it was the murdering of dozens of women during the witch trials, the massacre of Native Americans by the Pilgrims, or the expulsion of religious dissenters by the Puritans, or perhaps the slaughter of French Huguenots by Spanish settlers. There is plenty of religious history, and that history would have certainly informed the founders when establishing the U.S. It gave them lots of examples of what not to do. All these examples were active in the minds of the framers. But these were all events that took place in pre-American history. So part of the America Prays Initiative includes a pamphlet titled Prayers and Proclamations Throughout American History. Imagine my surprise upon learning that the authors of this particularly disgusting piece of propaganda think that American history started in 1607, 180 years before the U.S. Constitution would be written. As Ron Swanson would say, history began on July 4, 1776. Everything before that was a mistake. But I digress. 1607 marked the landing of the first settlers in the Jamestown colony under the British flag. It was an unmitigated disaster, followed by a charmingly named period in history known as the Starving Time. In the pamphlet, they cite a prayer after making the following statement, quote, "No contemporaneous documentation exists to verify its authenticity," end quote. The prayer is essentially a promise to spread Christianity to a population that already had its own religion and to stand up a Christian theocracy. Admittedly, I'm paraphrasing, but there's like 17 of these things, so give me a break. The second of these prayers and proclamation lurches forward to the 1620s to talk about the Puritans and the Pilgrims. Groups often conflated with each other for political expediency, but again, omitting some minor details. The pamphlet combines the Pilgrims and the Puritans and discusses their search of, quote, religious self-determination outside the Church of England, end quote. At least they didn't say they were fleeing England in search of religious freedom. That's what my history teacher told me. As discussed, the Pilgrims arrived at the New World and almost immediately began murdering Native Americans for worshiping the wrong god. But they didn't come from England. They came from Holland. The Pilgrims spent a decade in Holland trying to establish their theocratic government, but they decided that their kids were becoming too woke, being around the more enlightened people of the Netherlands, and had to find a new space for their religious crusade. The Puritans read as a footnote, like an unlucky appendage to the story of the Pilgrims. But the pamphlet claims that the alliterative Puritans and Pilgrims represented American values like self-governance and republicanism, for which I'd like to see a citation or two. And now we arrive at Thanksgiving, 1620. In this section, the author identifies the fact that the Pilgrims had lost half their colony and joined the Native Americans for a feast. Interestingly, no prayer is offered, though we are assured prayers were said. A suggestion of that prayer, or what it might look like, is offered, but no direct evidence of what was said is presented. Curiously, the prayer offered seems to thank God exclusively for their good fortune. It doesn't mention the folks who fed them, the Wampanoag. The fact that the Wampanoag were probably just trying to make sure these poor white folks didn't starve to death isn't really part of the chosen narrative, and the pesky detail about the Pilgrims subsequently killing these so-called savages in the name of God is omitted once again. It's hard for me to choose which of these 17 examples is the most offensive of the collection, but here we have number 4, a solid contender. This section is titled The First Prayer in Congress, 1774. Curiously, the author doesn't call it the Continental Congress, just Congress. In 1774, the colonies were still under English rule, and having a chaplain there to lead prayer isn't especially noteworthy. The founders wouldn't vote on independence for another 2 years. But that isn't the worst part. The problem with this passage is Reverend Jacob Duché, an Anglican, that's the Church of England by the way, clergyman who was selected to be the chaplain. His association was viewed as potentially beneficial as a matter of political expediency because at that time reconciliation with King George III was still on the table. But this guy, Duché, would turn out to be a bad bet. Not only did Duché abandon the cause of independence, but he also wrote Washington and basically told him he was an idiot for trying to rebel against the English government while also denigrating the brave soldiers of the Revolution. Duché would eventually be tried for high treason in absentia in the state of Pennsylvania. Unbelievably, he asked Washington to mediate with the state authorities of Pennsylvania to get his property back. Since this asshole told Washington that he only agreed to be the chaplain so he could presumably keep his enemies close, I won't even address the actual prayer. What the hell were they thinking of bringing this clown from history into their narrative? Were they so desperate for an example they had to quote a bona fide traitor? The passage goes on to romanticize the tradition of prayer in Congress, ignoring the stream of complaints from congressional chaplains which included a lack of attendance and a general disrespect for the chaplains themselves. The situation was so bad in the 19th century that Congress moved several times to abolish the chaplaincy altogether, a fact conveniently left out of this passage. The 5th section of this pamphlet uses a classic propaganda tactic known as proof by volume. The goal is to overwhelm you with a barrage of facts that are technically true, but lead to a false conclusion. They list 15 proclamations from the Continental Congress, 22 from John Hancock, and 7 from Sam Adams, all calling for days of prayer. The intended takeaway is that our government has always been officially Christian. But here's the critical distinction they hope you'll miss. Not one of these proclamations was law. They were non-binding ceremonial statements. The Christian Nationalists are trying to make you think that the ceremonial window dressing of government is more important than the legally binding secular constitution that the founders actually created. But the most blatant deception is how they handle George Washington. They take the closing lines of a formal state letter, edit them to look like a poem, and then forge his signature on a prayer by adding amen at the end, a word he never wrote. This isn't just dishonest, it's a fabrication, and it's the smoking gun that proves their entire project is an argument in bad faith. All right, let's move on to the 6th section of the pamphlet, titled Building the Military. This is where the authors really get out their needle and thread to weave their tapestry of bullshit. They present what looks like a single powerful sermon from George Washington about the need for piety in the army. The only problem is he never said it. Not like that. It's a Franken quote, stitched together from 3 separate orders issued over the course of a full year. The first part about profane cursing is from July 1775. The second about divine service is from 3 months later in October of 1775. And the last, most pious-sounding part about the blessings of heaven in our army is from July 1776, an order given as the Declaration of Independence was being read to the troops. They took 3 distinct orders from different moments in time, dishonestly edited them together, and invented a sermon Washington never gave. But they aren't done. Next, they bring up a chaplain named Abel Leonard, who they call one of Washington's closest military friends, which is a flat-out lie. Washington's inner circle is one of the most well-documented in history. Leonard was a chaplain that the general respected, not a close confidant. They exaggerate the relationship to set up their real con. They quote a long, explicitly Trinitarian prayer from Leonard and put it right next to Washington's name. They know Washington, the deist, never spoke like that. So they find someone who did, pretend he was Washington's best buddy, and use his prayer to put Orthodox Christian words in the mouth of a man who deliberately never used them. This isn't history, it's a theological bait and switch. All right, we're now at section 7 of the pamphlet. Prayer at the Constitutional Convention. We touched on this a little bit already. I've got to be honest, this one might be the most cynical and structurally important lie of them all. This is where the authors of the propaganda move on from just twisting facts. This is where they try to hijack the very creation of the Constitution itself. The story they tell is a simple and moving one. The founders were at a critical impasse, about to give up. A wise 81-year-old Benjamin Franklin heroically stood up and called for prayer. They took a prayer for recess, and when they came back, a miracle happened. Debate turned into compromise, and our glorious Constitution was born. It's a beautiful story. It's also a complete fabrication, a house of cards built on what they don't tell you. Here is the critical, unforgivable lie of omission. Benjamin Franklin's motion for prayer failed. The other delegates politely listened, and then they completely ignored it. They did not pray. They did not vote on it. They chose to solve their problems with secular debate and human reason. To cover for this inconvenient fact, the pamphlet creates a misdirection. It mentions a prayer given during a recess, hoping you won't notice that it wasn't a prayer at the convention. It was a public 4th of July party that some delegates happened to attend. And this is how they invent their miracle. They take a failed motion, misrepresent a holiday speech, and create a false cause and effect to replace the real story of the Constitution's creation, which was weeks of grueling secular political horse trading. It's a cheap magician's trick built on a logical fallacy called post hoc ergo propter hoc. After this, therefore, because of this. It's an insult to the founders' intelligence, and it's an insult to yours. All right, next up is section 8, which covers George Washington's inauguration. Now, this is where the propaganda gets a little more slippery. Instead of using one big obvious lie like the one about the Constitutional Convention, they use a different tactic here. They hide their most important lie in a list of smaller, verifiable truths, hoping you won't notice. They list 7 so-called religious elements of the inauguration. Number 2 on their list is the claim that Washington added the words, "So help me God," to the presidential oath. Let me be crystal clear. This is a myth, a complete fabrication. There is not a single solitary eyewitness account from 1789, not a letter, not a diary, not a newspaper, that says he spoke those words, and dozens of people maintained a record of the event. This particular story was invented by a notable author of fictions like Sleepy Hollow, who was evidently unafraid of weaving a little mythology into his biography on the first president. Washington Irving was just 6 years old when the inauguration took place, more than 60 years after the fact. The possibility is suggested that he heard those words from a soft-spoken Washington with no amplifying technology across a very crowded street from a balcony of the Federal Hall in New York City. Compounding these untenable circumstances is the fact that Irving himself didn't even claim to hear it. His biography simply says, "We are told that the religious appendage was added to the oath," which is like someone saying, "Studies show," or "They told me to." This kind of myth-making was common. Just think of the Valley Forge prayer scene and the "I cannot tell a lie" fabrication, which were amplified by the consummate capitalist Parson Weems in an effort to sell books to a very young and impressionable America. The Constitution gives the exact secular wording of the oath, and all the evidence says that is exactly what Washington did. He followed the law. They need this lie because it shows Washington going beyond the secular Constitution to make a Christian vow, something Washington's character would have prohibited him from doing. Since it never happened, they just pretend it did. And they hide this lie by surrounding it with things that are true. Yes, he used a Bible. Yes, his speech mentioned providence, a common deistic term. Yes, he went to a church service afterward. They hope the truth of those facts will rub off on their central lie. Then, to top it all off, They include a prayer from a Jewish congregation. This is a very cynical move. They're using a minority faith as a token, a shield, to pretend their project is some inclusive Judeo-Christian thing. In reality, all they're doing is co-opting a Jewish prayer to provide cover for their Christian nationalist agenda. So the whole section is a masterclass in deception. It's a mix of verifiable facts, a foundational myth, and a cynical tokenism, all designed to build a false foundation that looks solid until you actually check the receipts. So we've picked apart the first 8 sections of the American Praise pamphlet, the parts they claim are the foundation of our country. The rest of the document jumps ahead to John Quincy Adams, Abraham Lincoln, and the modern era, and we'll get to those eventually. But they've already shown their hand. They've built their entire case on a series of myths, half-truths, and outright lies about our nation's founding. I'd like to remind you that they happens to be the current administration, the occupants of the White House. We're not talking about some incel in his mother's basement. This is official. Let's just recap what we've seen so far. They started their story of America with a prayer they admit is inauthentic. They tried to sell us the Pilgrims as pioneers of freedom while hiding that they fled a country that was too tolerant for them. They presented a bona fide traitor, Jacob Duché, as a patriotic hero, and they built an elaborate fiction about a prayer-fueled miracle creating our Constitution, when in reality, the founders explicitly chose reason and debate instead. This isn't just bad history. This isn't just sloppy work. This is a deliberate strategy, and it has a name: cognitive warfare. Cognitive warfare isn't about defeating an enemy on the battlefield. It's about controlling a population's mind. It is the systematic process of replacing verifiable reality with a politically useful myth. You build a false foundation in people's minds, and once they're standing on it, you can build any political structure you want. You can convince them that the most un-American ideas are, in fact, the purest form of patriotism. And that is why I started this podcast. Because the oath I took as a young soldier wasn't to a flag-waving myth or a fabricated history. It was to a real secular constitution, built by flawed but brilliant men who chose reason over revelation. Defending that reality, that true foundation, is the most patriotic thing I can think of.